Medieval sailors crossing unfamiliar waters described encounters with strange figures rising from waves, creatures that seemed both human and animal, beautiful yet unsettling, and always tied to danger. These mermaids and sirens appeared frequently in ship logs, maps, and coastal chronicles, revealing how strongly imagination shaped interpretation of the sea. The medieval ocean was vast and poorly understood, making it a space where mystery filled the gaps left by limited navigation and incomplete knowledge. Sailors relied on oral tradition as much as observation, carrying stories that blended fear, faith, and experience into a shared maritime culture. Mermaids were often drawn into margins of maps, positioned near unexplored waters as warnings rather than decorative fantasy. Artists depicted them with flowing hair, fishtails, and calm expressions, emphasizing allure rather than aggression. This visual language reflected the belief that danger at sea often arrived disguised as beauty or comfort. Sirens, inherited from earlier classical mythology, evolved within medieval storytelling into figures representing temptation that led sailors away from safe paths. Preachers used these stories to illustrate moral lessons, comparing the unpredictable ocean to the spiritual risks faced by travelers in everyday life. Mariners living with constant uncertainty found meaning in narratives that gave shape to storms, currents, and isolation. The repetition of mermaid sightings across regions suggests that these figures served as a shared symbolic vocabulary among seafaring communities. Sailors described glimpses of pale shapes in waves or distant figures resting on rocks, moments where exhaustion and unfamiliar wildlife blurred perception. Some encounters were recorded with surprising seriousness, reflecting a worldview in which unusual creatures could exist beyond known shores. Coastal towns incorporated mermaid imagery into carvings and folklore, linking maritime identity with tales of both wonder and warning. Illuminated manuscripts included sirens alongside dragons and sea serpents, placing them within a broader tradition of symbolic creatures. These depictions often showed mermaids holding mirrors or combs, reinforcing associations with vanity and distraction. Medieval audiences understood that beauty itself could become a moral test, especially in environments where survival required constant vigilance. The ocean's vastness created psychological space for imagination, allowing sailors to interpret unfamiliar sights through familiar narrative frameworks. Early navigational maps marked unknown regions with sea creatures, not only to warn travelers but also to acknowledge uncertainty about distant waters. Mariners encountering seals, walruses, or manatees may have interpreted these animals through existing myths, transforming natural observation into legendary encounter. Accounts of mermaids sitting upright in water or lifting their heads above waves echo descriptions of marine mammals seen from a distance. Long voyages intensified loneliness and fatigue, conditions that could shape perception and amplify storytelling among crews. Chronicles describing mermaid encounters rarely separated spiritual meaning from physical description, reflecting a worldview where both existed simultaneously. The presence of mermaids in bestiaries linked them to lessons about restraint, reminding readers that not every beautiful thing offered safety. Artists carved sirens into church architecture, placing them near entrances as silent reminders of temptation waiting beyond sacred space. These images served as moral signposts for travelers preparing to leave the safety of land. Maritime folklore blended classical Greek traditions with Christian teaching, creating hybrid figures that reflected changing cultural values. Sirens gradually shifted from bird-like beings of ancient myth into fish-tailed figures more familiar to medieval European audiences. This transformation reveals how storytelling adapted to new environments and religious contexts. The medieval sea became a canvas where imagination filled the unknown with creatures that expressed both fear and fascination. Sailors' tales spread rapidly between ports, reinforcing belief in a world alive with hidden life beyond the horizon. Even those who doubted literal existence accepted the stories as meaningful reflections of maritime experience. Mermaids symbolized the fragile boundary between safety and danger that defined life at sea. The ocean's unpredictability encouraged narratives that gave shape to invisible risks, turning waves into stages for moral storytelling. Chroniclers writing from land interpreted sailors' reports through religious frameworks, emphasizing lessons rather than empirical proof. These layered interpretations allowed mermaid legends to endure even as navigation slowly improved. Over time, the creature's image spread across Europe, appearing in heraldry, literature, and coastal art. The widespread presence of mermaids reveals how deeply maritime culture influenced medieval imagination. Understanding these stories requires seeing the ocean as medieval people did: vast, uncertain, and filled with meaning as much as water. Mermaids and sirens emerged from that uncertainty as symbols of the sea's dangerous beauty, drawn into history because the unknown demanded a face. Medieval writers rarely describe mermaids simply as creatures of curiosity, because their presence almost always carried a warning about distraction, desire, or loss of direction. Church sermons compared the unpredictable sea to the spiritual journey of life, portraying sirens as symbols of temptation that lured travelers away from safe paths. Artists depicted mermaids holding mirrors or combs, visual cues that connected beauty with vanity and self-deception. These images appeared frequently in manuscripts and cathedral carvings, reminding viewers that danger could arrive quietly rather than violently. Sailors facing months of isolation interpreted stories of sirens through personal experience, understanding how longing and fatigue could cloud judgment. Maritime folklore emphasized the sound of alluring voices carried across water, echoing earlier classical myths while adapting them to Christian moral teaching. The transformation of ancient Greek sirens into fish-tailed mermaids reflects how medieval Europe reshaped inherited mythology to match its own worldview. Writers described ships veering off course after encountering mysterious figures near reefs or rocky shores, blending navigational hazards with symbolic storytelling. These narratives reinforced the importance of discipline at sea, where even small mistakes could lead to disaster. Monks copying bestiaries presented mermaids as creatures that sang sweetly while concealing hidden danger, illustrating lessons about appearances versus truth. Readers were encouraged to see the ocean as a place where moral vigilance mattered as much as technical skill. Pilgrims traveling along coastal routes carried these stories inland, spreading maritime symbolism far beyond the ports where it originated. The repetition of mermaid imagery across Europe suggests that audiences recognized the creature instantly as a warning rather than a novelty. Some legends portrayed sailors resisting sirens through prayer or discipline, reinforcing the idea that spiritual focus protected against distraction. Chroniclers sometimes framed shipwrecks as consequences of ignoring warnings associated with sirens or enchanted waters. These accounts reveal how storytelling allowed medieval communities to make sense of tragedy in environments where survival depended on unpredictable conditions. The ocean's vast emptiness encouraged projection of human fears onto imagined figures, transforming isolation into narrative form. Sailors described moments when moonlight reflected off waves in ways that resembled human shapes, fueling belief in beings that existed just beyond certainty. Artistic depictions emphasized calm expressions rather than aggression, reinforcing the idea that temptation appeared gentle rather than threatening. This portrayal aligned with theological teaching that sin often arrived quietly, disguised as comfort or beauty. Heraldic imagery occasionally included mermaids, symbolizing vigilance against emotional weakness or moral distraction. Storytellers in coastal taverns blended real navigational hazards with imaginative embellishment, creating tales that entertained while instructing listeners. The popularity of these stories reveals how deeply maritime culture influenced medieval ethics and identity. Sirens also appeared in secular romances, where knights encountered enchanted waters that tested their loyalty or resolve. These narratives expanded the creature's meaning beyond religion, embedding it within broader cultural storytelling traditions. Maps marked dangerous coastal areas with mermaid figures, signaling reefs or currents that could threaten inexperienced sailors. Such imagery functioned as visual shorthand for risk in an era before precise nautical charts. The blending of myth and navigation demonstrates how symbolic language shaped practical decision-making at sea. Some scholars suggest that sightings of seals or manatees, glimpsed briefly in shifting light, reinforced belief in mermaids among exhausted crews. The human tendency to interpret unfamiliar animals through known stories allowed legend and observation to coexist without contradiction. Medieval audiences did not demand strict separation between reality and symbolism, allowing mermaid tales to carry both emotional and practical significance. Writers used the sea's beauty as a metaphor for spiritual danger, suggesting that what appeared peaceful could conceal hidden risks. The siren's voice became a literary device representing the pull of desire that threatened to disrupt discipline. Through repetition in art and literature, The mermaid evolved into one of the most recognizable figures of medieval maritime imagination. These stories offered a way to confront fear without losing wonder, transforming uncertainty into narrative meaning. Sailors listening to such tales before voyagers prepared themselves psychologically for the emotional challenges of the open sea. The endurance of mermaid symbolism reveals how deeply medieval society linked the unknown ocean with inner moral struggle. Even as navigation improved slowly, the stories continued because they expressed truths about human vulnerability rather than literal geography. Mermaids and sirens became reflections of the choices sailors faced between discipline and distraction in an environment where small errors carried enormous consequences. In the medieval imagination, the sea's dangerous beauty found its voice through these figures, turning uncertainty into a story that could be remembered long after the waves grew calm. Medieval and early maritime logs sometimes recorded encounters with strange figures rising from the sea, descriptions written with surprising seriousness by sailors accustomed to long periods of uncertainty. These accounts rarely used identical language, yet many described human-like shapes, glimpsed briefly before disappearing beneath waves or along rocky coastlines. Navigational charts included drawings of mermaids positioned near dangerous waters, suggesting that the creature functioned both as symbol and warning for future travelers. Cartographers working with limited geographic knowledge often filled blank spaces with sea life, reflecting the belief that unknown regions were alive with hidden creatures. Some logs described mermaids sitting upright on rocks, combing their hair or watching ships pass silently, reinforcing the association between beauty and danger. Chroniclers writing from coastal towns repeated these stories, blending eyewitness reports with inherited folklore to create layered narratives. Mariners interpreted unusual reflections on the water's surface through familiar myths, transforming fleeting visual impressions into encounters with legendary beings. The repetition of mermaid sightings across regions suggests that shared storytelling influenced how sailors described what they believed they saw. Long voyages across unfamiliar seas heightened emotional tension, making crews more likely to interpret ambiguous shapes as meaningful presences. Ships traveling near polar or tropical waters encountered unfamiliar marine animals that could appear strikingly human-like when viewed from a distance. Walruses lifting their heads above water or seals resting on rocks may have inspired descriptions that resembled traditional mermaid imagery. In warmer regions, manatees observed briefly through waves could be interpreted as figures with arms or faces, especially by sailors already familiar with mermaid legends. These interpretations demonstrate how expectation shaped perception in environments where visibility was limited and fatigue common. Medieval audiences reading such logs accepted them as plausible accounts because the ocean remained largely unmapped and mysterious. Maps created during this period blended empirical navigation with imaginative imagery, placing mermaids alongside sea serpents and dragons. The presence of these creatures on charts did not always indicate belief in literal existence, but acknowledged the unpredictability of distant waters. Sailors sharing stories in ports spread tales of mermaid encounters, reinforcing collective belief through repetition rather than direct evidence. Some logs described mermaids approaching ships without hostility, watching silently before disappearing into deeper water. These calm encounters contrast with the dangerous reputation of sirens in earlier mythology, reflecting evolving interpretations of the creature. Chroniclers occasionally framed sightings as signs or omens, linking them to storms, shipwrecks, or sudden changes in weather. The blending of observation and symbolism allowed writers to express emotional truths about maritime life without strict reliance on physical proof. Artists illustrating maps often exaggerated mermaid features to ensure recognition, creating a visual language that traveled across Europe. Pilots navigating unfamiliar coasts used such images as reminders to proceed carefully even when the charts themselves lacked precise detail. The widespread presence of mermaids in maritime art reveals how deeply sailors relied on narrative to make sense of the unknown. Bestiary writers incorporated reports from travelers into their descriptions, further blending legend with geographic exploration. Readers encountering these texts understood that the ocean held mysteries beyond ordinary experience, making mermaids seem plausible within their worldview. Some accounts described singing voices heard across water at night, possibly shaped by wind patterns or echoes mistaken for human sound. The human tendency to interpret unfamiliar noises as meaningful voices contributed to the persistence of Sirens stories. Sailors returning home often embellished encounters to capture attention, transforming ambiguous sightings into memorable tales. These stories traveled faster than ships themselves, shaping expectations for crews preparing to depart on new voyages. The consistency of certain details across logs suggests that shared cultural frameworks influenced how sightings were recorded. Rather than fabricating stories entirely, sailors interpreted real experiences through the language available to them. The mermaid therefore became a bridge between observation and imagination, allowing people to articulate wonder and fear simultaneously. Cartographic traditions preserved these images long after navigational knowledge improved, revealing how powerful symbolic creatures remained within maritime culture. As maps grew more accurate, mermaids gradually shifted from warnings about physical danger to reminders of the sea's mystery. Yet the creature's image persisted because it captured the emotional reality of exploration better than precise coordinates alone. The ocean's vastness encouraged narratives that gave form to isolation, transforming waves into stages for imagined encounters. Understanding these sightings requires recognizing how medieval sailors interpreted the world through story as much as through direct observation. Logs and maps preserved mermaids not simply as creatures but as reflections of the unknown spaces that shaped human exploration. Through ink and illustration, the medieval sea filled with imagined life, revealing how mystery itself became part of maritime history. Beyond shiplogs and sailors' tales, mermaids and sirens appeared throughout medieval Europe's visual culture, carved into church walls, painted in manuscripts, and woven into coastal identity. Cathedral sculptures often depicted mermaids holding mirrors or combs, symbols that connected beauty with distraction and moral testing. These carvings stood at entrances and archways, functioning as silent warnings to travelers leaving the safety of sacred spaces. Illuminated manuscripts framed biblical stories with siren imagery, blending spiritual teaching with maritime symbolism familiar to medieval audiences. Artists portrayed mermaids with calm expressions rather than aggression, reinforcing the idea that danger arrived quietly rather than violently. The repetition of these images across England, France, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe suggests a shared visual language rooted in both theology and seafaring tradition. Coastal towns incorporated mermaid figures into local architecture, reflecting pride in maritime culture alongside awareness of the sea's risks. Bestiaries describe sirens as creatures whose beauty concealed danger, placing them alongside dragons and serpents within moral instruction texts. Readers encountering these illustrations learned to interpret the creature as a metaphor for temptation rather than a zoological curiosity. Medieval artists balanced realism and imagination carefully, ensuring that mermaids remained recognizable yet symbolic. The popularity of these images reveals how strongly the ocean influenced artistic expression even among communities far from the coast. Monks copying manuscripts adapted older classical depictions of sirens into fish-tailed forms more familiar to medieval European viewers. This transformation illustrates how inherited mythology evolved to match changing cultural and religious frameworks. Heraldic imagery sometimes included mermaids, representing vigilance against emotional weakness or moral distraction. Such symbols allowed noble families to express identity through imagery rooted in both legend and ethical teaching. Festivals along coastal regions occasionally featured mermaid effigies, blending storytelling with communal celebration. These performances transformed moral lessons into shared experience, reinforcing cultural memory through ritual. Artists painting nautical scenes used mermaid figures to fill empty ocean space, acknowledging mystery where geographic knowledge remained incomplete. The presence of sirens in secular romances demonstrates how deeply maritime symbolism permeated medieval storytelling traditions. Knights encountering enchanted waters often faced mermaid figures that tested their resolve, linking romance literature to religious moral themes. Sculptors carved mermaids into ship prows and decorative panels, reflecting both superstition and aesthetic fascination with the sea. The creature's image bridged sacred and secular contexts, appearing equally in churches and marketplaces. Illuminated manuscripts frequently placed mermaids near scenes of judgment or temptation, reinforcing theological lessons visually. These images communicated meaning instantly to viewers regardless of literacy, making them powerful tools of education. The combination of elegance and danger within mermaid imagery allowed artists to explore complex emotional themes through simple forms, Medieval viewers recognized the creature immediately, understanding its symbolic message without lengthy explanation. Pilgrims traveling between regions carried memories of these images, contributing to the widespread recognition of mermaid symbolism. Artistic workshops reused familiar motifs, ensuring consistency across generations of manuscripts and carvings. Over time, mermaids evolved from purely moral warnings into broader cultural icons associated with exploration and wonder. Yet even in decorative contexts, echoes of caution remained embedded within their imagery. The presence of mermaids in medieval art reveals how imagination filled the spaces where scientific understanding had not yet reached. Artists used flowing hair, curved tails, and serene posture to create figures that felt both beautiful and unsettling. These visual choices reinforced the idea that the sea's greatest dangers often appeared peaceful at first glance. Church leaders allowed such imagery because it communicated moral teaching effectively without requiring written explanation. The persistence of mermaid motifs across centuries demonstrates their adaptability to changing artistic styles. Even as navigation improved gradually, the creature remained a symbol of the ocean's unknown depths. Viewing these images today reveals how medieval Europe turned maritime fear into art that felt contemplative rather than terrifying. The carved and painted mermaid became a reminder that beauty and danger could exist within the same form. Through stone and ink, medieval artists preserved a vision of the sea shaped by mystery and moral reflection. These enduring images transformed imagined encounters into visible history, allowing the ocean's dangerous beauty to remain present long after the waves passed. Medieval writers rarely portrayed mermaids as harmless curiosities, because their beauty was intended to communicate moral tension between desire and discipline. Sermons compared the unpredictable ocean to the human soul, framing sirens as embodiments of temptation that distracted travelers from their purpose. Church art depicted mermaids holding mirrors as symbols of vanity, encouraging viewers to reflect on the dangers of self-obsession. The association between water and spiritual testing allowed storytellers to merge maritime experience with religious teaching seamlessly. Sailors facing months of uncertainty understood these stories as psychological preparation rather than mere entertainment. Sirens inherited traits from classical mythology, yet medieval Christianity reshaped them into figures that emphasized moral vigilance. Writers described sailors drawn toward song or beauty only to encounter hidden reefs or storms, blending navigational hazard with symbolic lesson. The calm posture of many mermaid depictions reinforced the idea that danger arrived quietly rather than violently. Medieval audiences recognized that temptation rarely appeared monstrous, making the mermaid a fitting representation of subtle risk. Bestiary texts emphasized the creature's dual nature, combining elegance with warning to illustrate the complexity of human choices. Chroniclers sometimes linked mermaid sightings to shipwrecks, interpreting tragedy as evidence of spiritual distraction. These narratives allowed communities to make sense of maritime loss through moral interpretation rather than randomness. Sailors returning from voyages carried stories that blended observation with inherited symbolism, reinforcing belief in the sea's dangerous beauty. Artistic depictions placed mermaids near turbulent waters or rocky shores, visually linking the creature with physical risk. Monks copying manuscripts ensured that these lessons reached inland audiences unfamiliar with the realities of the ocean. The repetition of mermaid imagery across Europe suggests that the creature served as a shared moral language rather than a regional myth. Writers emphasized restraint as the key to survival, portraying disciplined sailors as resistant to siren temptation. The metaphor extended beyond maritime life, encouraging listeners to avoid distractions in everyday spiritual practice. Some legends describe sailors surviving encounters by refusing to look directly at mermaids, symbolizing the importance of focus and self-control. These stories reveal how medieval culture framed beauty itself as a test rather than an unquestioned virtue. The sea's vast emptiness encouraged projection of emotional fears onto imagined figures, transforming isolation into narrative meaning. Sailors experiencing fatigue or loneliness may have interpreted natural sounds and shapes through familiar mythological frameworks. Medieval maps featuring mermaids reinforced caution, reminding navigators that unseen hazards lurked beneath calm surfaces. The creature's enduring popularity reflects humanity's fascination with the tension between attraction and danger. Writers used poetic language to describe mermaids as reflections of the ocean itself, unpredictable yet captivating. This interpretation allowed audiences to understand the sea not only as a physical environment but as a moral landscape. Heraldic depictions sometimes softened the creature's threatening aspects, transforming mermaids into symbols of identity rather than warning. Yet the underlying association with temptation remained embedded within the imagery. Festivals and storytelling gatherings allowed communities to reenact mermaid tales, reinforcing shared cultural memory. These performances transformed moral lessons into experiences that could be seen and heard rather than merely read. The balance between fear and fascination made mermaids particularly effective symbols within medieval imagination. Writers emphasized that beauty without discipline could lead to ruin, a lesson mirrored in the unpredictable nature of the sea. The persistence of mermaid stories demonstrates how narrative shaped behavior by providing memorable images rather than abstract rules. Sailors preparing for voyages carried these stories as reminders that emotional strength mattered as much as navigational skill. The sea's dangerous beauty became inseparable from the mermaid's image, reinforcing the idea that survival required constant awareness. Even as navigation improved slowly, the creature remained a powerful metaphor for the risks of distraction. Medieval audiences understood that the greatest dangers often appeared peaceful at first glance. Through storytelling, mermaids transformed uncertainty into lessons about humility and focus. These narratives reveal how medieval Europe used symbolic creatures to navigate the emotional realities of exploration. The mermaid endured not because people believed only in fantasy, but because her image captured the fragile balance between wonder and warning that defined life at sea. As medieval exploration slowly expanded, sailors encountered unfamiliar marine animals that may have influenced how mermaid sightings were described in logs and stories. Seals resting upright on rocks or lifting their heads above waves could resemble human figures when seen from a distance through mist or fading light. Walruses with whiskered faces and large bodies inspired descriptions that blended curiosity with existing myths about sea people. In warmer waters, manatees surfaced slowly and moved gently, creating silhouettes that matched traditional mermaid imagery for sailors already primed by folklore. The human mind tends to interpret unfamiliar shapes through known narratives, allowing natural encounters to merge with legendary expectation. Medieval observers did not separate myth from observation strictly, because their worldview allowed meaning and experience to coexist without contradiction. Chroniclers writing from land incorporated sailors' reports into texts that framed these encounters as both natural wonders and moral lessons. Travelers returning with exotic animal skins or bones reinforced belief that unknown creatures lived beyond Europe's shores. Fossil discoveries occasionally inspired speculation that ancient sea beings might have once existed, blending geological evidence with imaginative storytelling. The gradual spread of natural philosophy encouraged some scholars to question literal interpretations while preserving symbolic significance. Writers proposed that mermaids represented misunderstandings of real animals, yet such explanations rarely diminished the creature's cultural power. Maps continued to include mermaid imagery even as navigation improved, demonstrating how tradition influenced artistic representation. The ocean's scale ensured that uncertainty remained, allowing symbolic creatures to survive within maritime imagination. Sailors hearing unfamiliar animal calls carried across water at night sometimes described voices that echoed siren legends. Wind patterns, echoes, and reflections created sensory experiences that could easily be interpreted through existing myths. The blending of perception and expectation reveals how storytelling shaped the emotional landscape of exploration. Medieval audiences valued meaning more than empirical precision, allowing mermaid tales to coexist with emerging curiosity about nature. Some writers describe mermaids not as literal beings but as allegories for the sea's unpredictable character. This shift demonstrates how medieval thought evolved gradually without abandoning inherited symbolism. Artists continued to depict mermaids elegantly even as scholars debated their physical existence. The creature's persistence in literature and art reflects humanity's enduring fascination with the boundary between reality and imagination. Sailors preparing for voyages often shared stories of encounters with strange sea life, reinforcing a culture where wonder remained part of navigation. The ocean functioned as a stage where observation and myth merged, creating narratives that felt emotionally true even when physically uncertain. Chroniclers preserved these accounts because they expressed the lived experience of exploration more effectively than simple geographic description. As maritime knowledge expanded, Mermaids gradually shifted from feared warnings to symbols of mystery and beauty. Yet the association with temptation and distraction remained embedded within cultural memory. Writers exploring the natural world began to reinterpret mermaids as reflections of human imagination rather than undiscovered species. This reinterpretation did not erase the creature's significance, but transformed its role within storytelling. The survival of mermaid imagery across centuries demonstrates how symbols adapt to changing intellectual environments. Renaissance artists later drew upon medieval traditions, preserving the figure even as scientific understanding advanced. The boundary between myth and science remained fluid for many generations, allowing mermaids to inhabit a space between belief and metaphor. Sailors encountering unfamiliar ecosystems continued to describe experiences through poetic language shaped by earlier centuries. The ocean's beauty and danger ensured that symbolic creatures retained emotional relevance regardless of scientific explanation. Even modern audiences recognize the mermaid instantly, a testament to the enduring power of medieval maritime imagination. The persistence of these stories reveals how deeply exploration and storytelling are intertwined within human history. Medieval Europe did not abandon mermaids when knowledge evolved, but reinterpreted them as reflections of perception itself. Understanding this transition helps reveal how cultures adapt symbols without discarding their emotional meaning. The mermaid therefore stands at the intersection of natural observation and moral narrative. Between imagination and real creatures, the medieval sea remained alive, with forms shaped as much by human thought as by water and wind. Through changing centuries, mermaids endured as reminders that the unknown ocean-inspired stories where wonder and warning moved together like waves. When we look back at medieval mermaids and sirens, we begin to see that they were never only creatures of fantasy but reflections of how people understood the unknown sea. Mermaids embodied the tension between wonder and caution, reminding travelers that beauty itself could become a form of risk. Stories preserved in logs, maps, and carvings reveal a world where mystery filled the spaces beyond familiar coastlines. Medieval people did not separate symbolism from experience, allowing imagined beings to exist alongside real storms and shifting currents. That danger often arrived quietly rather than through sudden violence. Sailors hearing these stories before voyages carried them as emotional preparation for isolation and uncertainty. Church artists and writers transformed maritime folklore into moral language that could be understood far from the shore, blending geography with belief. Over time, the creature evolved from warning to cultural icon, yet its deeper meaning remained rooted in discipline and restraint. Medieval audiences recognized that survival at sea required resisting distraction as much as navigating waves. Even as navigation improved, the image endured because it expressed emotional realities that maps alone could not capture. Modern viewers often see mermaids as romantic fantasy, yet their medieval origins speak of caution rather than escape. These imagined beings gave voice to loneliness, longing, and the quiet pull of the horizon. Sailors staring across empty seas projected hope and fear onto shapes that flickered between reality and illusion. Medieval chronicles preserved these stories because they captured something deeper than fact. The sea's dangerous beauty became inseparable from the mermaid's image, shaping how generations understood the risks of curiosity. Artists carved and painted these figures with elegance, allowing warning to exist within beauty rather than outside it. The medieval ocean was filled with imagined life, not because people lacked intelligence, but because mystery demanded narrative form. When knowledge was limited, storytelling allowed communities to navigate uncertainty together. The siren's voice, whether heard in myth or metaphor, reminded listeners that the greatest dangers often began as invitations. Through these stories, the sea became a mirror reflecting human vulnerability as much as natural power. Even today, the image of a figure rising from waves carries echoes of centuries spent searching for meaning beyond the horizon. These tallies invite us to consider how imagination fills the spaces where certainty fades. The ocean remains vast even in the modern world, reminding us that mystery never disappears entirely. Mermaids and sirens continue to appear in art and literature because they embody a balance between longing and caution that feels timeless. By understanding their medieval meaning, we begin to see them not as relics of superstition but as reflections of human experience. The sea's beauty still calls travelers outward, carrying the same quiet promise and hidden risks that shaped ancient stories. Listening to these stories today allows us to glimpse a world where imagination guided survival as much as skill. The waves that once inspired mermaid legends continue to move beneath the same sky, carrying echoes of voices that tried to understand them. Thank you for spending time with the history shaped by the ocean's mystery and the stories people created to face it.